before we start, I'd like to recognize the teams for making it this far. In opening government, we have Carleton ZK. In opening opposition, we have UBC PW. In closing government, we have Waterloo HA. And in closing opposition, we have Western WP. My name is Amaar. I'll be your chair for this round. Judging alongside me, I have a wonderful panel who will let introduce themselves.
Darren, here there.
Chloe, here there.
Aniket, he, him.
Rudra, she, her.
And without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
We support a world in which people have accountability right now, in which people care about the consequences of their actions, they care about the ways that the things that they do affect other people, and they see that the life they should have meaning for the people that they see rather than some unknown. That is what we support on our side of the house. So proud to propose. Before I get into why we support this resolution, I'd like to start with a model, a bit of a framing for this debate. We don't think an extensive model is necessary. We think that the examples do a great job defining what life after death looks like. What we propose is the alternative, though, that being that people have a recognition as a collective community whole, because this is kind of a theoretical debate, that the end is the end. Once you die, you are dead. There is no life. There is no reincarnation, no heaven and hell, etc., whatever other religious theocracies or cultural theocracies may believe comes after. Once you're done, you're done. Okay. What we mean by prefers is sort of the burden of this debate. We think that's where we are really going to take this debate. We think the burden kind of lies in two ways. We are going to show you how this creates a better world both for the individual because their personal life has more meaning and they can find greater personal fulfillment. And secondly, how it will create a better reality for the collective because people will do better things, take better actions. That is what we are going to prove to you on our side of the house. With that said, how are we going to do this? 3 primary contentions I bring to you today. First and foremost, we'll be discussing how this shifts the narrative of why life should have meaning and the impacts of why specifically that is so beneficial both for the individual and for the collective. Secondly, I guess that is our second, the effects on both the collective versus the individual. And lastly, how this will lead to greater cohesive social accountability rather than the conflicting and ultimately competing other ideologies that we see in the status quo today. Why this world will be better. So proud again to propose. Okay, so the first point I have, that of shifting the narrative of why life should have meaning. Let's take a look at the status quo. I'll first be addressing 3 examples, first of reincarnation, second of this afterworldly retribution, that being heaven and hell. Okay, let's take a look at the example of reincarnation. We see that oftentimes some part of the narrative that can accompany this is the ability to try again. This idea that the lessons that you learn in this life may or may not be able to be carried over into the next life, but irregardless, the damage that we see done by that narrative is that people don't necessarily have the same level of accountability that exists if they recognize that the world in which they live, the life in which they live, is the finite life. The reason for this is because this idea of trying again. When we take this narrative that people have a second chance, it means that ultimately there is less burden placed on that first chance. When I tell you I'm a first-year student, and even if I don't win this debate today, I can come back and try again next year, it places a lot less heavy burden on me than a 4th-year student like Madison waving at me in the audience who can't come back and try again. So what we tell you is that we see this narrative of creating a system in which people don't necessarily have the same value placed on their actions in the present. We see that as massively problematic. Sure, I'll take that.
We think that lots of these beliefs provide an incentive for people to be good in their lives. Don't you think that that's a poor characterization?
Actually, we think that that's massively problematic, this idea of people being good in their lives. That brings me very well into the second idea that I was about to touch on, this idea of almost a karmic retribution that comes in the otherworldly experience, right? After death. We think that's massively problematic for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it creates a system where, at its base moral root, you are only doing good things because you think that it means you will have good things done to you later on. We think on a moral standpoint, that's just massively problematic because we think that people should be incentivized to do good things here and now because A, they want to do good things, or B, they want to create a better reality for the world that they live in. They want to create a better reality for the world around them now. Second reason that we think people should do good things is this idea that we see in the counter world, the world that we're proposing. And that is we think that there will be a much greater emphasis on the legacies that people leave. Why? We think that it's very natural that people do want to think that the lives they live now have meaning after they're gone. We think that that's natural and we can't really fight that on our side of the house. What we will say is that instead of thinking they'll have some kind of like direct life that they get to live after they're gone, rather they should be focused, we think that they will be focused if this resolution is commonplace, on the life that exists in the present world that they are no longer a part of. What we mean by that is the creation of legacies. We can look at like the legacies of majorly successful people that have impacted the life that we live right now, whether it be like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., anyone who has like died and done something good on this earth, their legacy lives on. We think that should be the motivation for people. We think that the motivation that is brought up explicitly in a POI of, look, if people do good things, then good things should happen to them. It's the same idea as like, look, I'll only do well at this debate because I'll get a trophy, not because I'll like learn a lot and actually make the world better. We think that's massively problematic. Okay, so secondly, this idea that I want to bring to you of like the effects on community and effects on the individual. I think I kind of already touched on this within my first point, but I want to reiterate that A, not only does it make a better world for the individual, where they are motivated to do things in their present life because they won't have a second chance. They can actually, like, as my partner said to me in prep time, get up off the couch, do something in their current life because they realize that they won't have a second chance, so they have to make the most of what they have right now. And secondly, because they have to deal with the consequences of their actions, be those good or bad in the status quo, they don't have to wait for some kind of like negative karmic retribution in the afterlife of hell. If they do something now, they actually have to own up to their own actions. We think that idea of like owning up to their own actions makes life better for them for two reasons. First and foremost, it makes people better people. We think that people will live happier lives if they can recognize that the actions that they have now have real life consequences now. If I'm thinking about doing a bad thing, and I think about the ways that it will affect the people around me and affect my own life right now, we think that is like a greater incentivizer, and in fact a better incentivizer for society than saying, look, I'll do that action right now, and I guess God will tell me at the end whether it was right or wrong. We think that if we can focus on like our actions here and now, then A, we have people making like more consciously better choices throughout the entirety of their lives rather than just at the end. And also, we think that like it'll make the community better. That's kind of the second point I was getting into there, this idea of like a greater collective. As so long as people are focused on the outcomes of their actions right now, they will do better things to affect the people around them. Because again, they're not waiting for someone, some objective judge at the end, or some kind of like thing at the end to tell them what's right or wrong. They can focus on what's right or wrong right now, the consequences of their actions. That applies both to reincarnation and to like retribution. Okay, and then lastly, the thing I wanted to bring up about cohesive social accountability. We see that right now there are a lot of like conflicting thoughts and ideologies about what happens after death. Whether that be the idea of heaven and hell, whether that be the idea of like reincarnation, or even just like individuals who focus on like this idea of nihilism, right? Look, nothing happens, and so there's no point. We tell you that if we shift the narrative, not that there's no point, but rather the point is right now, the point is the legacy that you can live, and the point is the effect, the tangible effects that you have on people around you, we think that creates a better world in which everyone is held to the same standard. We don't have some people saying, look, I'm waiting for God to judge me. We don't have some people saying, look, I'm waiting for my next chance. We don't have other people saying, look, there's no point anyway. Rather, we have everyone on the same ground. Everyone will know what's right or wrong. It'll create a more like morally cohesive society, which can make life better for everyone. So proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for your speech. I now invite the leader of opposition to open the case for the opposition friends. Here.
The government says they want accountability right now. We think that on our side, we provide a clear mechanism through which we create accountability for people on the collective. Okay, so we think that on opposition, in today's debate, we would prefer a world where individuals believe in life after death. Obviously, this is not a world where everyone must subscribe to these beliefs, but those who choose to should. In order to win today's debate, we must prove to you that a world in which people prefer a life after death is a better world. So we have two main points of substantive on why we think this is the case. First, because it creates greater morals, in particular in relation to charitability, and second, why it creates greater hope and why that's a good thing. So first on the issue of greater morals and charitability. We think that the fear of hell and the desire to reach heaven in a vast number of the kind of religions and ideologies that people subscribe to that have life after death mean that there is a very clear incentive for people to uphold high morals. This looks like things like small-scale things, such as being kind to your neighbour, respecting other people, and seeking forgiveness and reparation for past wrongs. We think in an abstract sense, this makes the world sort of a more peaceful and kind place when these very strong incentives occur for people to be good and for people to do good things in their community and as a person. And they clearly occur more under our side. There are lots of incentives in the world, like particularly in a capitalist system and a very harsh world, for people to be selfish. And we think that being very selfish is something that could probably make you very happy. And we think that people are sort of inclined to do things that do make them the most happy. So we think that a world where there are very clear incentives for people to be good is obviously like a very good thing on our side. We think that, of course, under both sides, we will retain some good and some bad people, but under our side, we provide that additional incentive for people to be good and people to be particularly charitable. So then I'll go on to talking specifically about charitability, but first, yes.
Would you agree with the dictatorial regime that coerces their people to follow the law based on the fear of hangings and public executions?
Okay, I don't think that, obviously people are scared of death, and we think that, executions are always going to be sort of something, I don't know, but, we think that actually people are able to, as I'll get to a bit later, this kind of hope and, less fear of death is a positive thing that we get on our side. I look forward to hearing more about that in your case, though. So, in terms of charitability, we think that a lot of these kinds of ideologies provide very clear incentives for people to be more charitable, and this has created a very practical benefit under our side. We think that the desire to first of all just be a good person and to make lives better for other people is one of those reasons, but also the call to evangelize. So this has created a global movement of development which has been absolutely critical in being able to improve lots of regions in the world that are otherwise neglected because there aren't those sort of power incentives for governments to provide that sort of aid. This is in places like tiny islands in the Pacific where people who have gone there to evangelize and to seek access to the afterlife have absolutely revolutionized these communities and otherwise would not have been able to access the kind of development that occurs. We think that in a lot of these communities, people really love and value the missions as a critical part of their communities and has been absolutely critical for their development. We think that this kind of charitability also exists on a smaller scale where people want to donate to charities and particularly during particular holidays, people will donate to different organisations, as well as people just being charitable in their everyday lives in a very practical sense, providing soup to someone who has just lost a family member or something like that. We think that this kind of fear of going to hell and the incentive of wanting to be a good person and being able to get into heaven in the afterlife is a very clear incentive for this charitability, and that under their side they lose a lot of that incentive, and we think they need to prove how that they will continue to have that under their side. So going on to the issue of hope, we think that hope is always a positive thing, even if it is false hope. So we think that particularly for underprivileged people, this manifests in a few ways. First of all, it means that they're able to look forward to a future life. They're able to look forward to a future life, even if things in their actual life are very shit. They can look at things. Things can be dealt with more adequately. They don't sort of fall into this snowball effect of my life will never get better. We think that that's a good thing and actually helps them to be able to have the courage to continue persevering, because they know that something good will come out of it, even if their life on Earth is not is really bad. And we think that even if this hope is false, it makes life easier for people, and that's a clear benefit on our side. And we think that like also the fear of death is to a large extent alleviated when people have this idea of life after death. And we think that's also a very positive thing, because like the fear of death can be absolutely crushing for a lot of people and means that they aren't able to function as like a person in their lives. And we think that if this sort of thing is able to alleviate some of that fear, as well as like a lot of the crushing grief that comes when you lose a very close family member, if you have the idea that you'll be able to reunite with them in the afterlife, then there's a positive thing for people being able to continue their lives and like move on and be functional people. So I'm just going to go quickly through a couple of the ideas that we heard from government just to finish off my speech. So first we heard about, like, in the case of reincarnation, people have the idea of being able to try again. We think this is a very poor characterization of these reincarnation ideas. We think that, like, when people are reincarnating, they're constantly trying to improve themselves, right? So we think that, like, that means that there's a clear incentive for them to still be, like, being good people in their lives. That's why, like, when lots, like, in countries that, like, have lots of, where Buddhism is really prominent, people, like, feel like they have to be a monk at some point in their life, and that's part of, like, that process. We also think that, like, the issue of karma, that they said that, like, people should be good just because, like, they want to be good rather than being selfish. We think that's really nice, but we think that, like, the counter is that we have actively less good in the world. Even people acting for selfish reasons, we would much rather a world where there is more good action than, like, none at all. And we think that also, like, there are still clear incentives for people to be good under our side. So we've brought to you a case where we think that we've clearly got more good under our side and people have more hope.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to further the case on the document.
I don't see why side opposition just gets to assert that during reincarnation, people are just going to be trying to consistently get better. I think if I know I'm going to have 99 more lives, what does this one matter for me? Why do I have to do good things now? Honestly, if I was told that I would just have 99 more lives, I'd probably spend one of them just sitting on the couch the entire time, just doing whatever I feel like that day. I don't see why there's this idea that I will start to do good because of that, that I will start continuously getting better. I think when you get better is when you think that there's a legacy that you need to leave behind. This is my one shot. I'm not going to get 60 of them. This is my one shot to do good. I better not screw it up. I think that's when you start to get people actually doing good. In this speech, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to give some just rebuilding and refutation to what we heard from side opposition, and then I'm going to turn a more holistic look as to what do the different worlds look like, and why is ours actually objectively better in so many different ways. So first, just as like refutation, we were told that people have a greater morals. This is sort of like an implicit clash, the idea that creates an incentive for people to be good, and like being selfish is something you might otherwise do. Like one who really don't buy that model, do something to create morals, just that entirely is based on what you believe, right? So if one person believes that like killing a certain group is a good thing, as many people are brainwashed to believe in the status quo, they will think that that's an innately good thing. They will think that killing a large group of people, content warning, sorry, not used to that, that killing a large group of people is something that will actually end up helping them get to the afterlife, helping them get to heaven, rather than believing in just what is good for people. I think empathy is just something that is ingrained in people, that they don't want to do bad because they don't like to see others suffer. I don't see why I have to think, oh, well, God's looking at me now, so I better do something I'm good right now, otherwise I won't go to heaven. I think that's a really bad way of structuring morals. Never mind the fact that it becomes selfish. I think the fact that they just completely avoid why we care about the things that, why we care about the reasons why people do things. I think the fact that they just decide to ignore them and they just say, well, people do good, is one, just completely avoiding the debate, but also, they also have to provide backup as to why everyone's morals will be the same, in that they will want to do good in the way that we see that. They talk about how people are evangelical. I'll take you a second, and then they help people just for the sake of afterlife, and it causes people to donate to charities. Again, we think that one of the reasons if I donate to charities is because some of those commercials saying donate $5 now, they look really bad. The situation those people are in. I want to do good, not because I think that $5 is going to get me closer to heaven, but because I want to help that person's life. I think one, that's just a more moral way of giving, a more moral way of doing good. But even if it's not, we think there's still a very good mechanism for people to do good on our side. In fact, we think it's better. Sure.
Most bad actions in this life will be at a very little cost to you, but at a much larger cost to the people around you. Most good actions will be at a larger cost to you, but at a better cost to the people around you. Shouldn't people be given some incentive structure to actually reap the benefits of that, even if it's later?
Okay, one, I think you don't understand. You're arguing for the status quo. But also, in this circumstance where we're talking about good actions versus bad actions, I think it's really important to consider that whether the costs to me are large or small, we're still trying to do good because of the fact that we have empathy for people, because of the fact that we actually want to see people not suffering. They tell us about hope. So this is where we start to get into very direct clash. They say that people can still continue after bad things happening to them, and during reincarnation people are trying to do better. So first I want to consider the characterization of someone that let's say grew up and at 13, for whatever reason, circumstances, they killed someone. Right? At that point, they've already committed one of the deadliest sins, in the sense where at that point they might think there was no chance for you to go to heaven at all. What is your case at that point that they can start saying, well, now I might want to, let's say, come out of prison and do good things? There is no reason for them to do that whatsoever. They're just going to do a bad thing and think, well, now I'm screwed. Might as well continue doing whatever I feel like doing from now on. Whereas on our side of the house, we get to say, okay, it's not about heaven or hell. I've said that I've done a bad thing, but I can still do better at this point. I can still change my life. I can do some really good things in the future. This idea that now, okay, I've done a bad thing, I'm done, is ridiculous, and it causes some really, just bad circumstances on your side of the house. With that, I just want to redress something that I think really wasn't touched, this idea of legacies. Doing good to create lasting positive impact, not just and also for the lasting positive impact of here and now. Realistically, if I'm someone that's going to think, well, I'm going to be reincarnated 65 years down the line, what's the reason for me to solve the problems in today's world? I'll let someone else pick it up, and then I'll enjoy the benefits of that when I get reincarnated. No, in this case, it's I want to change the world right now. I want to solve all these injustices now, not just start the process. I want to do the whole thing in my lifetime. We think that's a much better mechanism for change, because it allows a lot less complacency with the evils in the world, with the horrible things in the world, instead of just saying, well, someone else will pick up the slack. They said that justice is, we talked about the fact that justice is based on a moral compass, and this is something, the ability to call out injustice is really important. Because this narrative of only God can judge me, only God sees me, is actually really harmful to the world that we live in. The status quo, people can justify doing really shitty things by just invalidating those who call them out for being shitty. They can just say, okay, hurt others, say, look, we'll see at the end we're okay, because at the end of it we'll all be back to see what the result of that is. Right? Only God can judge if it was right or wrong, so see you in heaven. That's ridiculous, because that means that there is no reason for me to be held accountable for the things I do right now, because it's entirely based on what God says at the very end. Again, ridiculous. And changes that narrative. It focuses on human effect now and on legacy. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what our world looks like and what their world looks like, and why that's so important. Before I do that, if there are any POIs, I'll take one now. Okay. So our world, we think we have a lot more personal accountability. We think this is really important because you end up with this idea that I want to do good because of the person I am. We think we end up with a lot more of a moral system rather than I'm doing good because someone in the sky wrote in a book that I should be doing good. Again, that means you have an incredibly coercive ability for someone in power, for example, a priest or a rabbi, to tell you what is good, right? So that's really bad because that puts all the power in those actors. Let's be clear here. We're not talking about God passing down commandments directly to people. We're talking about other people who we have no control as to whether they're good people or not, entirely deciding what your moral compass ends up being. We much prefer a world in which every person has their own moral compass. They're held accountable to themselves. They're accountable to the fact that they want to do good things to people. They want to be empathetic, rather than a horrible person being able to force them and tell them what it is. We think that it also gives us the ability to change. My partner touched on this briefly, and I think I redressed it with this idea of someone doing a horrible thing early in life and then being able to change. The whole point is you don't get that on their side of the house. You entirely end up with this conception that what you do, that one bad action, might define you for the rest of your life, because at the end of the day, what defines me, it's not my actions, but it's what God says about my actions. It's at the end of the day whether I end up in heaven or whether I end up in hell. That's the entire judgment on their side of the house. On our side of the house, we have a much more holistic judgment. It's about all of the actions, all the good you do, If I do good to one person, I'm happy because I did good to that one person. If I do bad to one person, I'm upset because I did bad to that one person. There isn't this, okay, let's put it on a scale, let's see where we land. Okay, good, heaven, we're good. Or, okay, hell, none of that stuff that we did was valuable. We think that's a really much better conception of justice that's really important. On their world, we have this absolvement of guilt because all the way till the very end, or reincarnation, in which case you have no guilt whatsoever because you'll be back and you can fix it in the next life, and you have an inability to change and a lack of accountability. It's because we think we give you a much better world where people are much more held to account and end up doing much better things for the world and really care about the world that they live in. We are very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech. I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to wrap up the top half of this debate. Here, here.
Panel, first let's begin with some analysis on why people do things and for what purpose people do things, before moving on to refutation of everything we've heard from government, then finally reconstruction and Wayne. So first let's analyze the actor of people, right? Why do people do things? How do people act on things? What do we do to exist as people? We think people in general are inherently self-interested. The things we do are for the sake of pursuing some kind of happiness, and the main incentive to do this is because happiness feels good, right? Whether it's just the biological importance of feeling all the serotonin, or just literally seeing someone smile and being happy because of this, we think this is generally why people do good. So now let's do some refutation, now that we've set this up, of everything we've heard from side government so far. We think the best idea they've really given you in today's debate is this idea of legacies. They're people are going to not think, people are going to live life as if they're only going to live this life once. They're not going to be cooked potatoes because they think they can do it all over again. They're going to want to create legacies. This is going to be how we get a better world. So we have a few responses to this. Firstly, they tell us it's shallow for people to want to do good for the sake of going to heaven, but we think it's actually equally shallow for people to want to do good for the sake of leaving behind a good legacy, right? We don't think this is way better on the moral standpoint of their side. We don't think this is really true in the first place. But moreover, we think when you create a legacy, the way in which you are judged for this legacy you create is how people perceive you. It's how good people think you are, how much your neighbor thinks how awesome you are. We think it's nothing to do with an omniscient being judging the things you do. We think when you are being judged by some kind of God, you care about every little thing you do, whether or not it is beneficial. We think this is a net benefit that is exclusive to our side of the house. They never give you this. They give you no mechanism for why legacies are better in the first place, besides people just thinking, oh, I'm going to look really good in the future. But moreover, we think in general, no one really gives that much of a shit about the legacy they leave behind, because once you're dead, who the hell cares, right? Once you're dead, it's no longer your responsibility. We think there's way less incentive under their side of the house for people to leave behind a good legacy, because to be really honest, I can do a lot of really bad things in this life if I feel I'm not going to be punished in any way, right? Because I'm not going to hell, who cares? Just hopefully I don't go to jail, right? We think under their side of the house, they don't have this incentive. This is something exclusively that we bring to you on opening opposition. We think we win on this entire point of legacies. Really, we think this is the only creative point they give you at all. They also tell you oh, this is going to make individuals want to do better because they just want to feel good. Okay, well, we have a few responses linked to what I told you about people in general, right? We think people do good things for a few reasons. Firstly, it literally just feels good, right? People live life and they pursue happiness and they want to live life to the greatest, not because they think they're not going to be reincarnated, but because they just want to be happy, right? We think reincarnation is not really like even the main incentive why people do good things in the first place, but we think it's actually an added incentive under our side of the house that makes people much more likely to do good things. They don't have this under their side of the house. We don't think people do more good things under their side of the house as a whole. And finally, they brought you this point on like how people are going to be held to the same standard, like how the standard is, but we think like the standard is probably going to be actively worse under their side of the house. Because what's the comparative? Under their side of the house, people are going to set their own moral standard of how they're going to repent, right? If you kill someone, you're going to say like, oh, if I do like 3 good things, like, you know what, it'll cancel out, things will be good. We think under our side of the house, people are actively afraid of like going to hell or like just having like being judged by God. We think at least under our side of the house, people want to repent. They think like, if I do as many good things as possible for the rest of my life, at least maybe God will judge me a little less, right? Moreover, we think like this whole idea of like people feeling like they're doomed to hell forever is very centric on like one set of beliefs, one set of religious beliefs like Christianity, right? We think there are many other religious beliefs that believe in the afterlife that don't focus on like whether or not you're condemned to hell forever. We think like their entire reputation of this point was just contingent on like people being Christian. We don't think this is very holistic under their side of the house. We think this also falls under their side of the house. Cheryl, take that.
Considering the afterlife is glorified to that large of an extent, how common or easy is it to misconstrue the idea of it for your own benefit?
Okay, we don't think it's our benefit under our side of the house to protect people who are misconstruing it to their benefit to like make life actively bad for people, right? We tell you again and again, like under our side of the house, we just have a net benefit of people like having an incentive to do better, of people like believing that like whatever they do that is good is going to lead to like benefits in the afterlife or like just being less judged by God or something. We think this is what we are defending under our side of the house. It is not our like burden to defend like corrupt regimes. But even if like it is, because I think that's likely to be the extension that back half is going to bring us, we think like the idea of like religious persecution, we think like it's not our burden to defend religion, as like a religious conflict often is like more tied with power structures than the complex institutions that like are the real structure of how this works, or like the real cause of the conflict, not the belief of the afterlife. But we also think the idea of the afterlife provides an incentive to care for others more. We think under our side of the house, people just generally care more, and we think like this is a net benefit overall. We think like even if that's true, we still get more benefits under our side of the house. I'm not going to take any more POIs. Now let's look at what Mary told you with her points, right? Firstly, she told you we're going to get greater moral standards under our side of the house because like people just care more about like actual consequences like going to hell as opposed to this very abstract idea of whether or not they're doing it. We think the main problem with their side is that there is no like very concrete idea of whether or not what you're doing is good. When people are setting their own standards, this tends to be like lowered because people just tend to be easy on themselves, right? We think we'd rather people be like God-fearing and like just feel like they need to do good, because we think like when you are used to constantly doing good, this trickles down into like the way you live your life in general, right? When people buy into these religious beliefs or these beliefs that like there is reincarnation, people just believe that there is hope and good in the world. We think this leads to people being better overall. We think this is a net benefit that is exclusive to our side. At the end of the day, we think opening opposition has given you like the most benefits and like the most reasons for why it's just good to have these beliefs, why people will be better, why society will be better. We think we've affected the widest range of people. We don't think anything our backup says will be more important than this, and we think we very adequately responded to everything that's going to be brought up on side government. We think like because we think people should have hope, because people should believe that there is an afterlife, and that is the greatest incentive for people to do good in their lives. For this reason, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for your speech. I now invite the member of government who start the back half of the debate. Kim here.
I think so far within this debate, the problem with characterization is that we've missed out the most important group within this debate. debate, which is the vulnerable individuals who are most likely to be affected by the idea of religion and the idea of afterlife. Meaning, individuals who are affected within society, who are disenfranchised and are essentially at a disadvantage in terms of if they're victims of war, victims of financial instability, if they're minorities, or victims of discrimination. We believe opposition consistently ignores the effects that essentially happen over these individuals and how they're consistently screwed over by the idea of afterlife and how it's imposed forcefully onto these individuals. Before I move on to my extensions exclusively as to how the very idea of afterlife is principally abhorrent and has detrimental effects for this group of people, a few rebuttals. So OO basically tells us three things. First, they tell us that, especially under their world, they create a greater moral standard for individuals, and they give us layers of benefits as to how that, what essentially happens, why people have the incentive to do good things like charitable work, things like that. Three responses to that. First, we believe it's absolutely subjective based on religious scripture and misinterpretation, meaning it's easier to misconstrue what exactly moral standards should be or are in terms of goodness and as a whole. Second, we believe it's important to recognize who dictates what this is, meaning misinterpretation is easily dictated by individuals who are within positions of power, who are able to profit off of the idea of religion and the idea of afterlife. Third, we believe at gunpoint, we reject systems that force you to be good at gunpoint at the end of the day, because if we tell you as an individual that you can only be good because if you aren't, we're going to throw you in hell, that's a system and a narrative that we absolutely reject, because we believe individuals should do certain good things for helping other people from within, not for a selfish reason as to I'm going to save myself from hell and things like that, right? More importantly, they essentially never show us a comparative as to why a world is never moral without an idea of afterlife. They never take that burden, they never make that comparative. Second, they tell us that essentially they give hopes to people based on the idea that there is life after death. Death itself is not traumatic. Again, two responses. First, in the current world, majority of individuals believe in afterlife, yet we still fear death. The idea of death in itself is still very traumatic because departure from this world and the pain that comes from it is extremely scary. Second, if they consider death to be extremely traumatic, can you imagine what the idea of hell essentially is for individuals when you literally tell children from a very young age if they don't subscribe to a particular standard of morals, they will burn in hell. We believe that idea of it in itself is extremely unfair of a burden for individuals. Third, they tell us at the end of the day that people will have their own sense of system of repent and things like that if you don't have an idea of afterlife. Again, two responses. We believe at the end of the day, if you have your own idea of afterlife, first of all, there are different groups of people who believe in different types of how they can repent and what type of punishments that they're going to be indulging in at the end of the day. Second, we believe in either world, we still have people going into courts. Under our world, we have more people giving trust in courts and trials because there's one law and one system of repent that everyone believes in and everyone follows. There's no subjectivity to that at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, we've shown you how OO did not fulfill their burden as to why the idea of afterlife can be misconstrued and it's okay, or why can't it be misconstrued at all, and they don't touch upon that. So given you that I already gave the characterization, moving on to the extension from CG exclusively, why the very idea of afterlife is principally abhorrent for these vulnerable groups. Two things. First, the principle. Understand that fundamentally, these individuals in these vulnerable groups take a decision based on a bet, meaning they have to either guess that they have to subscribe to something that hasn't been proven. Why do we believe that is extremely coercive in nature? Three reasons. First, this is not an option for these individuals to opt out of, meaning that the idea of afterlife is tied within religion, but more importantly, it is tied to a public narrative, meaning majority of individuals are pushed to subscribe to the idea that there is afterlife at the end of the day. So there is no option to opt out of that. Second, they're unable to question or confirm its existence. The problem with this is when individuals are unable to question its existence, they accept all the dire consequences that come with afterlife at the end of the day. So they completely subscribe to it without questioning it. Meaning that it is essentially a black or white situation and you're unable to fight the narrative. Right? The problem is that these individuals are forced to buy into religion as a whole because if you don't do so, you will go to hell. Meaning that these individuals aren't just believing in afterlife, but they're also forced to subscribe to a religion as a whole. The comparative is, under our world, if we don't have the idea of afterlife, individuals can either believe in religion based on the fact that they want to believe in a higher power versus they don't. There is no consequences that are subsequently tied to that decision at the end of the day. The conclusion of this principle is that your morality is now based on a superficial expectation, and you are coerced to subscribing to it and a religious belief. The impacts which are extremely important. We believe that it hurts majority individuals, especially these vulnerable people. First, it creates an extreme paranoia for individuals about the afterlife, because hell isn't just some small form of punishment, but it's a great, there's a great set of consequences to subjective sins that can make you burn. We believe that this paranoia is a constant existing within a lot of individuals' life. Before I move on, any POIs?
Okay, like the idea of subscribing to the idea of like reincarnation, like past lives, is not exclusive to like being a religious person. You can easily believe this even as a non-religious person and stop like limiting this to heaven and hell. Please do with like reincarnation and past lives.
The problem is with religion within itself, the idea of punishment in religion and most religions is that there is punishment after life. If not, you will be reincarnated. We don't understand how that's exclusive under their world. So moving on to the impacts, right? As I have told you, the unfair burden and how it creates a constant paranoia. Second, it allows dictators who profit off of these scriptures and misinterpretation to collectively control a large group of people. How? They are able to constantly push discriminatory laws and propagate things like hate crimes towards individuals who stray away from certain things that they want to impose upon these individuals. We believe that's extremely problematic because you allow a higher authority of power within the hands of individuals based on something subjective. Lastly, the harm for individuals who are living extremely shitty lives in the current status quo. These people are forced to believe that they should be okay with living these shitty lives because at the end of the day, if they're okay with it and if they pray every day, they will indulge in heaven. We believe that it's extremely unfair for these individuals to never question the system that has constantly screwed them over and why they shouldn't be able to thrive and essentially come out of that certain discriminatory bubble they've been living in so far. We've, at the end of the day, we've shown you three things exclusively from CG. First, why you subsequently screw over a large group of people who are forced to be coerced within this narrative to begin with. And second, we've shown you extremely harmful impacts that happen to collective group overall. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech. I now like to invite the member of the opposition to open the case for closing opposition. Here.
With the idea of an eternal soul comes a sense of purpose, a sense of contentment, a sense of fulfillment. This debate thus far has been the debate about religion versus no religion. We think that this is not the case. No matter what, in both worlds, there will be religion, and the question that we have to solve for in closing half is which belief is the best for religion? Which side of the house is best for religion? I'm going to talk about a huge issue, which is how it makes faith better in our world and point out certain harms in their world, right? But under this thing, I'm going to talk about how it makes religion really hierarchical, and I'm going to integrate some responses about the moral structures that they want to talk about. Firstly, with the belief there's a life after death, there comes an inherence that you have a divine being or divine purpose beyond that of your material life. Why is this good? In their world, religion is infinitely worse because it becomes more hierarchical and authoritarian. Because there's nothing after death, there's no divine being, the superseding authority of a religion becomes the Pope, it becomes the Grand Imam, it becomes the Dalai Lama. It becomes much harder to call them out for things like homophobia and sexual harassment in their world, because in their world, these powerful individuals who are self-serving replace God. It becomes harder to get diversity of theological discussions about the meaning of life. Note that this clashes directly with opening opposition. You don't have now to engage with a progressive religious base because on the divine duty to solve climate change or accept minority individuals, right? So how does this clash directly with opening government's case? Firstly, the idea of narratives and having better idols and legacies. In their world, this narrative, the entire religious narrative, is shaped by powerful individuals. While it may be true that idols like MLK and Gandhi may become more prominent, it's much more likely that the Pope or the Grand Imam is idolized even more because religion remains powerful and retains command over a substantial part of the population. And here's a response to closing opposition suspension, which is an idea of how our world misconstrues afterlife. In your world, you misconstrue religion as a whole and you give power to those who self-serve. On the secondary layer of analysis, on our side, you give agency and power to consequences which you don't feel bad for right now. For actions you don't feel the consequences for right now. Especially since, as my partner pointed out in your POI, since most bad actions impact other people than yourself, or is often hidden, like lying or cheating, you have a divine duty not to do that in our world. The comparative here is that those self-serving individuals are able to dictate what a divine duty is. B, this brings me to the moral structure that the government bench wants to base themselves on. Firstly, there's no any impact in sight on their world because there's no incentive structure. Regardless of how you want to argue about the moral structures that surround your world, at the very least, we have some good regardless of the reasons behind it, and there's a principle that we stand on that as long as there is good, it doesn't matter what the reasons are behind that. The impact of this is that life after death helps religious individuals cope with the chaos and crisis in the real world. Because some things can't be rationally explained away. The comparative from closing opposition is that in their world, in a world without life after death, religions are allowed to say that your current life is how you are being punished. This is infinitely worse for the minorities and the communities that they want to defend. If I'm a minority, and if I'm a person who is being fucking bombed in developing countries, it's infinitely worse because these religious people are able to say that this is how I'm being punished for my actions in the current world. There's no life after death, right? So I'm going to take a POI now.
Sure. So if we buy your characterization of religious leaders that you mentioned initially, of them having this leadership over individuals, then on your side, how do you contend with individuals who take up these homophobic or racist beliefs that they have on the basis of religion and use the defense that only God can judge me in the afterlife, so no one has a right to call me out on it right now?
At the very least, in our world, there are theological discussions about homophobia. There are theological discussions about these sorts of individuals. In their world, where the only superseding authority is one of the Pope or one of the Dalai Lama, all you have is them saying shit. You don't have the ability to think about God and what he or she wants you to do. You don't have the ability to think that there's a divine being. You don't have the discussion about what the purpose of divine duty is. On your side is a human person who's dictating everything that you do, right? So that's the response to the POI. So it gives the impact that you are of a lower station, that you are of a lower minority, and you are being punished for things that are happening in your world. No matter what, there will be religion. On our side, at least we get different arguments and different discussions about how you are seeing it. And at the very least, we have this. On their side, they are making claims. Your religion where you can only argue about facts about the real world. Gays suffer right now because God helps them, because God hates them, sorry. These kinds of things are going to be much more prevalent in their world compared to our side. At the end of the day, I'm going to distinguish myself from opening opposition here. They talk about this sense of hope and this sense of purpose. I gave you clear impacts and clear differentiation as to why these things are going to happen and also why their side is ultimately the most harmful towards religion. Religion is going to exist no matter what. Religion is important towards individuals, and this cannot be understated in the debate. Very proud to host.
I thank that speaker for his speech. I now invite the government with close the case to the government. Here.
I'm going to quickly take CEO out of this debate before I move on to further engagements onto the actual questions of this debate. And I think the best way to do that is to quote CEO themselves. Religion will persist regardless of which model of this earth you believe in. Assumedly, this means that the other facets of religion, like believing that in the eyes of God you are all equal, will also exist regardless of which side of this model you believe in. We don't buy their arguments that say that you will somehow create a hierarchical structure within this religion just because you take away the afterlife. The afterlife empowers a lot of things in religion, and the hierarchy isn't one of them. All right? Two, their entire idea of now real-world consequences are tied as punishment to current sins, which we think is a good thing, until we hear the banal example of Syrian children that are being bombed will be told that it is their fault they're being punished for their sins. What sins have these people committed? I think it's a little facetious for you to tell me that now people will misconstrue events that happen, bad things that happen in their life, as punishment as opposed to bad things that they happen in their life. In our world, if you listen to Jumanah's speech, when bad things happen in the lives of these people that are living in desolate conditions, what ends up happening is that they don't buy bullshit like they will be rewarded or in the afterlife, or they'll have a castle. Don't worry if a bomb is falling over your head. You're supposed to question status quo and say that why is the bomb falling over my head? There is no afterlife. I don't care about that. I care about what's happening to me right now. Good. Finally, about how now you think that gays should suffer because God hates them. No, under a world where the afterlife exists, it says gays should suffer because God hates them, and you should be God's emissary in hating on these gay people. Otherwise, you will burn in hell along with them. This does not exist in a world where you don't have the responsibility to carry out God's action, because your afterlife isn't tied. Your concept of afterlife isn't tied to what you do in the current world. Given all of that is done, I'll move into the clashes in this debate. 1, does doing good even matter? Number 2, what empowers individuals that need religion the most? Before I move on to the most important things of the debate, Charlotte here.
Okay, as we framed, if we assume the toxic power structures of religions exist under both sides, surely we would rather a world where people have the incentive of life after death to be charitable and to retain hope. How do you get these benefits?
I'm sorry, if the hierarchical structures exist under a world where afterlife exists, clearly the hierarchical structures are the ones that dictate what is good or what is bad. So, in your world, you're framing it as they do charitable things, but realistically, they could do anything that they tell them to do, including content warning here, strapping a suicide vest on and blowing them up. How else do they justify to these people to do that if they don't say that there is an implicit reward in some afterlife up in the sky, in the clouds somewhere? Right? Does doing good even matter? We contest the fact that doing good doesn't matter when that good comes out at gunpoint. No refutations from this up and down the opposition bench at all. 1, we've told you why it's principally abhorrent to force people into a structure of morality in which they are going to be subject to the worst kinds of punishment unimaginable to man if they don't abide by that structure. It's similar to if a dictator told you they're going to hang you, publicly execute you, and burn your body in the city square if you don't abide by the city's law. It doesn't matter what good those citizens do in that country, because we think that system in and of itself is abhorrent and one we should not abide by. But 2, we reject the idea that people do good at all, because people commit violence in the name of religion as well as not in the name of religion. People commit good in the name of religion and not in the good of religion. We think this is a wash in terms of whether people do good in terms of whether they believe in religion and the afterlife or they don't. People are going to do good and evil things regardless. On a principle level, we object to this. They present an idyllic picture of what the fear of afterlife does to people. We show you the real consequences of people being coerced into doing the most horrid acts known to humanity in the name of this afterlife, of this reward that you present to them. Secondly, the bastions of interpretation of what is good and bad in this society is going to be the ones that are enabled by this narrative of the afterlife. People that can take the narrative of the afterlife and run with it. Parishes, evangelists, churches, mosques. These kinds of people that have an active incentive to recruit and propagate their own ideology, because religion is competitive. Religion is about making sure more people around the world believe in your ideology, and that becomes the dominant ideology in the world. These people that have a perverse incentive to plagiarize the idea of an afterlife, and we think that's incredibly harmful. When opening oppositions tells us that we're not going to deal with the worst parts of this, we're not going to talk about evangelists and stuff like that, that's absolutely shameful. You cannot separate the power structures from the debate because it is the afterlife that empowers these power structures to begin with. We point out that this burden has been rejected today. It doesn't matter if they do good things because it's shallow, whether that's because they believe in a community or they believe in an afterlife. What matters is that this belief is malleable by people that have an incentive to bend this to their own will. We think that's problematic. So we don't think doing good matters. Doing good in a context in which people feel empowered to do good, empowered to do what they wish, are not shackled by these systems, is what's important. But finally, what empowers individuals that need it the most? No engagement to Jumanah's characterization that the people that need religion the most isn't elitists that can leave behind legacies or can reap monetary benefits. Because if religion fails for these individuals, they have a fallback. They can go back to their children, their legacies, and say that, hey, religion didn't work out, I'll probably go to hell, but hey, look at all this money I piled up, or look at these children I have, they'll carry on my legacy. Religion matters the most for individuals that have nothing else to rely on. A characterization, absolutely not engaged. But more importantly, we think that these individuals then end up in vicious cycles where bad things just happen to them, and they're convinced to just keep letting these bad things happen to them. Why? Because they're told that the rewards of this will be reaped in the afterlife. Compare that to our world, where we say that if bad things happen to you, you're supposed to give bad things back, or good things are then supposed to happen to you. If this does not happen, question the system, question the status quo on why these good things aren't happening to you, and don't just wait for your body to ascend to the clouds in hopes that those good things will happen to you. Proud.
I thank the speaker for this speech. I now invite the opposition whip to close out the off bench and this debate. Here we go.
I'm going to talk about two themes to include this speech in this debate. Thanks everyone, it's been a good time. Firstly, what makes religion better? Secondly, is there a life after death? I'm not going to actually be big into the second one, sorry. Firstly, as to what actually makes religion better. Okay, so the brunt of what we get from both sides is that religion is bad, and religion can do many bad things, and that the afterlife can be used to propagate bad things that religion can do. This is what Darren paints you. He paints you a picture of what the world would actually look like without a conception of the afterlife. Given the fact that people will always believe in religion because people want to believe in a divine purpose, and historically religion has been organized in such a way that it has been coercive to individuals with or without the use of the afterlife, we think that without the afterlife, people will still believe in divine purpose. They'll just think that the only influence that this divine purpose exerts is on this universe. Not a universe that we cannot imagine, that we can discuss, that we can debate about, but this universe and the facts of this universe. What this means is that pre-existing power structures that clothing government wants to talk about will always be entrenched to the point at which living figures are the ones that we look up to that get to dictate what religion does and the impacts of that divine purpose. We think that that's intrinsically worse, and we think that they haven't given enough analysis as to what it is that's exclusive about the afterlife that can make it more coercive. The best that we get from them is that the afterlife can make people, more fearful of what comes next. But I think that it's kind of fruitless in this debate to talk about whether or not religion is something that you can choose or opt in or out of, given the fact that for the vast majority of human history, people are born into religions that they didn't get a choice into. People are born into social sectors, into genders, into races that they didn't get to choose for themselves. What this debate is about is, given those religions that people are born into, whether or not they can discuss the labors of that religion, whether or not they can discuss the impacts of that religion, that becomes a lot harder on their side of the house, at the point at which you have to accept the way things are, because that's just the way that the God that controls this universe wants things to be, and you can't actually think that there's a larger divine purpose that none of us will ever fully grasp, because none of us will ever actually know what happens to us after we die. Okay, I think that it's important to note that, I'll take closing.
The problem with the afterlife isn't that it's scary, it's the fact that it externalizes the benefits, and it, while being scary and driving these people paranoid. Please engage with that.
Okay, so I think that in terms of externalizing the benefits, you need to consider the context of religions that actually operate today. The fact that there's a lot of theological discussion as to what the afterlife actually constitutes. And the whole reason why this discussion is possible is because we aren't aware of what the afterlife actually looks like. So you can discuss whether or not like gay people are going to go to heaven or hell. You can't discuss whether or not gay people are being treated poorly right now. And if you think that the reason why gay people are being treated poorly right now is only because of like divine, that's like the divine order of things, then I think that becomes a lot harder to question. Okay. I think that Darren also tells you why it is. The hierarchy that exists within religion is likely going to exist no matter what. And it's going to become a lot worse at the point at which we give a lot more divine authority to only people that we can empirically see and understand, only to people that we already give like so much authority to begin with, instead of thinking that like religion might have like superseding values and superseding ideals that we'll never be able to fully understand. They make religion a lot more empirical to defend and something that becomes a lot more entrenched in like pre-existing power structures on their side of the house. It does become kind of a wash, and I'm actually going to thank CG for pointing this out, as to whether or not people, it's important, how it is that people are doing good on either side of the house. But it also exclusively points out to you, and this is different from what gives you, why it is that there are a lot of incentives for people not just to be selfish, but for people to not consider their actual purpose in this universe, and to actually consider that they have a divine purpose to be a good person, and to be a member of their community, and to be somebody who just generally is a more kind person, because of the fact that there are a lot of things in this world that are incredibly hard to understand, that are incredibly hard to come to terms with, right? They tell you religion doesn't fix our fear of death, and afterlife doesn't fix our fear of death. I don't think that anything ever will, but there are a lot of questions about this world that we'll never understand. We'll never understand what happens to us after we die. We will never understand why our loved ones died and was taken away from us, why horrible people can have amazing things happen to them. But I think that the fact that there's this ambiguous gray area of what happens to us after we die can leave it open that maybe someday we might understand these things, can leave it open that someday we may be able to try to play a purpose in making this horrible world at least a little bit better, even if we're never actually reached that point to begin with. So I think in terms of actually making religion better, CO has actually given you an idea of how it is that we can actually make it so that religion is something that we can discuss and interpret, and something that we can use as a tool to make people feel more at ease about being a good person in spite of all the terrible things that they're simply going to have to rationalize and come to terms with on their side of the house. Okay, second theme in terms of why it is that whether or not there is a life after death. There's a reason why I'm spending significantly less time on this one. Okay, so no one knows whether or not there is a life after death. And I think that this is incredibly important because that means it's incredibly open to the imagination, and that means there's an incredibly diverse set of beliefs as to what the afterlife is and what it constitutes. And Darren exclusively points this out to you. I'll take opening. You haven't had a shot.
So since you agree that there are different beliefs as to what constitutes goodness that leads you to the afterlife, then how do you contend with this idea that people actually have a cohesive idea of social morality when they have such differing expectations of what actually gets them into the afterlife?
Right, it's the fact that you can have such differing ideas that means that you can discuss which ideals are better for society and which ideals are better for your duty as an individual to be a moral person to begin with, right? So I think that the fact that we can have such diverse discussions about what our divine purpose is and whether or not there is a life after death means that you have things like reincarnation, the idea that there's karma retribution, the idea that maybe our purpose is to universally salvage people from the eternal suffering that is life, and you have ideas like the Christian ideal of heaven or hell, the idea that if you are a better person, then you will reap better things in the afterlife, then you will avoid eternal punishment, and the discussions like this and the discussions around the diversity of this actually have a superseding impact on our world today in terms of actually understanding what our purpose is, because it's a lot easier to grasp those larger philosophical concepts when we boil them down to a narrative, when we're able to actually understand them in the context of larger things that we will never understand in the first place. On their side of the house, they just want to tell you that religion is going to be bad no matter what, and that the afterlife is just a tool that religions use to make religions worse. We told you exclusively why it is that the afterlife actually gives us an ability for everybody to access their own idea of what religion means, because nobody knows what the afterlife looks like, and that means that religions are actually going to be a lot more inclusive in the future. That's why religions are a lot more inclusive now. That's why we can argue that gay people should go to heaven. That's why we can argue that karma is something that everyone can access. That's why we can argue that women should be allowed to be in higher structures in church. That's why we make for better religion. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for his speech. I think they deserve a huge round of applause for that.